Hello, people in the room. Hello, the onliners in this truly hybrid event that we are organizing, the first event of Southeast European Studies at Oxford. I am Othon Anastasakis, and I'm the Director of Southeast European Studies at Oxford. And I'm also the principal investigator of the CSOX project that we will be talking about today on international diplomacy and EU-Turkey relations. We are delighted for this first hybrid public event, and also delighted that we will be presenting this project in a public form, which is a project and a partnership with Humboldt University in Berlin and funded by Oxford Berlin Partnership Fund. Now, we will be talking about a very topical issue today, Turkey's migration diplomacy, but also EU's migration diplomacy, which is a centerpiece of our project. And it basically deals with how both the European Union and Turkey are instrumentalizing the migration and refugee issue, very much from both sides of the EU-Turkey border. Our starting point in our research project is 2015, for very obvious reasons, a critical juncture, a very critical moment in the relationship between Turkey and the European Union. Since then, as we know, this relationship has been truly turbulent, unpredictable, adventurous, to say the least, with the migration issue becoming the dividing, but also the uniting issue between the two sides. And for us, this notion of migration diplomacy is our analytical platform through which we examine the relationship between the two sides and taking into account, obviously, the default connection of migration diplomacy with foreign policies and external relations, we have explicitly and intentionally broadened our remit in order to look at this issue from other thematic and interdisciplinary perspectives beyond foreign policy stricto sensu. In our brainstorming meetings of our network and team of scholars and experts, we have been discussing, among many other things, domestic politics in Turkey, domestic actors, social pressures inside the country, and even possibly go beyond Erdogan himself, who's been obviously dominant in this relationship, the de-Erdoganization, as we like to call it, and how that affects Turkey's migration diplomacy. We've also been looking from an EU perspective in the context of strategies, policy priorities, concrete projects that have been running around for the management of the refugee issue within Turkey, and how the EU, as we all know, has been outsourcing the problem beyond its own borders on the territory of Turkey. We often call this transactionalism. This is what comes to mind. And obviously that takes us beyond what normative Europe is all about, both within itself, but also in its transformational impact or other non-transformational impact in Turkey. And we have been also looking at geopolitical questions as well, and how other countries that have similar problems in the Middle East or external actors like Russia and others. And we have been also some output too. If you Google migration diplomacy CSOX, you will be able to go straight to the website, and you'll see there reports from our meetings on all these topics. We have also created a chronology of events since 2015. And for all of this, I would like to thank our partners from Humboldt University in Berlin, where our first meeting took place. But then all the other meetings we have been obviously obliged to do online. I would like to thank Ashley Torre, who's one the research assistant in this project and has been really important for us in drafting reports and processing our information. And so with this hybrid event, we are launching this kind of public debate on these very important issues, and with a panel full of stars, as you can see, you on the screen, the others on your computer screen, with Franck Duvell, who's the one that has been pivotal in terms of creating this project from the beginning. Başak, Kale, who's our very own, who's done her DPhil in Oxford, and is one of the foremost experts from a scholarly as well as a policy perspective in migration relations between India and Turkey. And Kemal Kirişci, I know you're still young, Kemal, but I'm going to call you the patriarch of migration studies in Turkey.
Let's say doyen.
Okay. And then, yeah, that's right. It's also a civilizational issue. So there, this is what I call a star-studded kind of panel. And now we'll hand over to another star next to me, Mehmet Karlı, who is will be the chair of this debate. And Mehmet, as many of you know, is a truly dynamic figure, a very powerful academic, lawyer, orator, with a very loud voice that is needed today, and a true inspiration for me because we've been doing this together in Oxford. So over to you, Mehmet.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the things that you said. Yes, Othon has actually spearheaded this project, and then just Othon and Franck, they are the two main principal investigators, and thanks to that collaboration, we could also get the Humboldt University on board, and here we are. I mean, we have been carrying out this project for over a year. This project has been funded by the Oxford-Berlin Research Partnership, and we've received that seed funding from that framework program, and this project will continue. And in my brief introduction, I'll only just try to outline the questions that we do currently have in our agenda. Basically, these are the questions that popped up regularly in our conversations over the last year, and these are the questions that will also lead our research efforts going forward. I want to share those questions with you briefly because those of you who are watching us online, those of you who are here in the seminar room, now that you know about this research project, if you're in any way interested into carrying out research activities on these questions, please do contact us. I mean, because when it comes to such research activities, as you can guess, the more the merrier when it comes to research power. There are, I believe, 3 or 4 main categories of questions that we are focusing on. The first category relates to conceptual issues. We believe that there is certainly a need to deepen the understanding of the impact of the migratory flows upon foreign policy formation. There are, of course, work out there that focus on the migration diplomacy, but we need to better understand the mechanics of the relationship between migratory flows and foreign policy decision-making, foreign policy making. And there is especially a need to come up with comparative frameworks within which we may compare democratic and non-democratic states. Mechanics of the relationship between migratory flows and foreign policy making is not the same. It varies from state to state. For instance, it's not the same in Turkey as it is in Germany, and we need to have a better understanding of those conceptual frameworks. That's one group of questions that we're focusing on. The second one basically tells us that, our brainstorming meetings have shown us that there is still a lot of need to come up with further comparative studies of currently ongoing cases and comparative studies historically. One might say horizontally and vertically. There is already a good amount of work out there that compares such cases like EU-Turkey versus EU-Morocco, EU-Jordan, EU-Lebanon, etc. But most such studies, especially those that focus on EU-Turkish relations, most such comparative studies understandably focus on the European neighborhood. But there is a good amount of potential to come up with other comparative cases from Latin America, from South America, from South Asia, from Africa. There is a good amount of potential of comparative studies there. Not only that, just in our brainstorming meetings, we worked with people like Gerasimos Churapas, with Kale Greenhill, who carried out a good amount of this research on the history of the use of forced or non-forced migration to affect foreign policy making. I mean, it's not a novel thing. It has been going on for centuries, perhaps, but it has been a significant quote unquote weapon, especially in the 20th century. And therefore, there is certainly a need to come up with such comparative historical studies. When it comes to Turkey, when it comes to the specific case of Turkish-EU relations and to the specific case of Turkey, the questions that interest us are the ones that Othon has already pointed out to a certain extent. We believe there is a need to de-Erdoganize the debate. I mean, Erdogan is, of course, a very significant figure. He is erratic, he may act on a whim, but he is certainly the decision maker. In the case of Turkey, his acts and words, his words and deeds are consequential. Therefore, it is certainly understandable that there is a focus on what he says and what he does. However, we should not forget the fact that he does not live in a vacuum. He performs in an institutional structure. He performs in a certain ideational setting. And those changes in Turkey's structure and ideational identity must be studied more in depth, and especially its impact upon Turkey's migration diplomacy related policies need to be studied more in depth. Turkey's just increasing distancing from the Western alliance, the decreasing role of the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, the increasing role of the presidential palace, the cacophonic role of the presidential palace. These are all the things that we believe need to be further studied. Frankly, from that, when it comes to that perspective, next week we're going to have yet another seminar that will specifically focus on the structural changes in Turkish decision making. And finally, when it comes to the EU part of things, there is the issue that Othon has already pointed out, which is EU transforming or turning Turkish-EU relations into a more transactional relationship. Rather than having the accession framework, rather than having a norms-based framework or an international regime-based framework, Turkish-EU relations have become more and more transactional, and we certainly need to study the causes and the consequences of that transactionalism. And actually, one of the questions that we are toying with in our minds is quite a provocative one. It remains to be seen still whether the EU has actually, in one way or another, contributed to the increase in authoritarianism in Turkey due to its policies that it developed within the migration diplomacy context. These are all the questions that we have in mind going forward. We will continue this project, and if any one of you is working on these topics, if you're interested onto those questions, we will be more than pleased to get in touch with you. Without further ado, just with this presentation of our project, now we're going to move on to our panel. As Othon has said, we've got a star-studded panel, and I don't want to steal too much time of theirs. We're going to start today with Başak Kale. Başak is our own Başak, as Othon has said. She has worked here. She has worked at Oxford for years. She did her PhD, DPhil, of course, here. She's currently an associate professor of international relations at one of Turkey's best universities, Middle East Technical University. Unfortunately, we don't have that many free-thinking universities left in Turkey, but fortunately, Middle East Technical University is still one of them. She's an associate professor of international relations at METU, and she is also the chair of European Studies and the coordinator of the Migration Research Program, again at METU. Başak just will be telling us, will actually draw the general frame of analysis for us as to the 2015, 2016 deal. What it was, how it performed, what has been its achievements, what have been its failures, and what is being currently negotiated in order to continue the deal. Başak, I hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this really glamorous, I don't know if I deserve it, introduction, Mehmet. And I noticed right now that everybody in the panel is somehow contributed to my career so far. I mean, there's Kemal with my first PhD from METU, who's there as a co-supervisor. And there's Othon there as my examiner. And there's Franck there during my comprehensive exams, and Mehmet as the Turkish Society president. I think if there were like 2 other people, that we will be my CV would be here in this panel. So thank you. As you have mentioned, I will be talking a little bit about the EU-Turkey statement, if it's kind of created a source of conflict or an opportunity for cooperation between Turkey and the EU with regards to migration diplomacy. And I would like to first set up like a little bit of the scene for everyone, and especially for the other panelists to continue with the discussion. So I will take you back a little bit like about 10, 15 years, very briefly, to give you the picture what it was and what happened. I mean, migration has been an important field of cooperation and collaboration for Turkey since 1999, when it was the time when Turkey was become an official candidate country. And Turkey's EU accession negotiations started on the 3rd of October 2005. And I know that date very well because it was the day that I started my DPhil in Oxford, 3rd of October 2005. And it was a glamorous time for Turkey. We were so much full of hope. We were thinking that this is it. I mean, Turkey is continuing with the political reforms. Things are changing. There was hope in the air. It was quite hopeful. But I will say, but it came with the negotiating framework document, where there was 35 chapters presented to be negotiated. And in Turkey EU accession negotiations, 16 chapters are opened, whereas only 1 chapter is temporarily closed. And 14 chapters are blocked due to the political decisions of the EU Council and also Cyprus with regards to the customs union extension to the 10 new member states, including Cyprus, that has joined in May 2004. So as you can see, it started with lots of hope, but over time, when we come to 2006, the screening reports of the 8 chapters were still pending for approval of the Council. And one of those chapters was the chapter 24, Justice, Freedom and Security, which includes issues related to migration management. So from 2005 until the 2015, the summer, we can see that it was the technical adoption process continued in a very slow pace, and negotiations and high-level political interactions became dormant. And through the events of the summer 2015, it resulted with the Turkey statement in 2016. Suddenly, we see a high level of political relations taking place quite regularly. I mean, Ankara was visited by the council presidents, parliament presidents, the commission president. It was a very lively time in 2015, 2016. So the rather gloomy picture of the Turkey relations in a decade, and suddenly things have been changing. So for Turkey, the motivations for vitalizing the accession negotiations in 2016, as you can see, from a dormant kind of political environment, was quite vigorous. Turkey really wanted to vitalize the accession negotiations, I mean, hopeful at least. And the modernization of the customs union was being discussed for a very, very long time, and there was no progress, there was no fruit was coming out of it. And the continuation and extending a high-level dialogue, achieving a visa liberalization, which was also on the table for some time, and the financial support mechanisms for the Syrian refugees in 2016 was important. And creating a safe zone in Syria was on the political agenda of Turkey, not necessarily with the EU or the US at that time. And also having a more progressive, more supportive progress report, in the sense that it was not going to be very critical. The EU had three main categories of goals in mind. I mean, the public opinion or the public relations were not looking great in the 2015 summer, where children were dying in the Aegean Sea. And it also had the aspect of the security and as well as the foreign policy. So in terms of security, if I have to go a little bit into details, in terms of security and public opinion related issues, it's aimed at reducing the deaths at sea. It was not looking good, and it was a humanitarian disaster in that sense, or at least slowing down and stopping the irregular crossings. And it also aimed to combat the smuggling networks and strengthening border controls. And with respect to the foreign policy goals, the global image of the EU was at stake, and the moral and ethical obligations were eroding, leading to a loss of public support and trust to the EU institutions and EU in general. And also keep in mind that this is the time just after the global financial crisis and also the Eurozone crisis. So there's already existing Euroscepticism in Europe, and this was then worsened through the general image, what was happening in Aegean in 2015 summer. And finally, the EU aimed at long-term integration of refugees in Turkey to make sure that there are not going to be further flows of irregular migrants over time. So in this context, there were domestic and international political pressures, and there were financial constraints. So that's the general scene, and that was the general context. So what are the instruments that we see? If we dig into the EU-Turkey statement, what are the instruments that we see? We see the good old accession process being underlined, but not necessarily quite heavily utilized. There was a readmission agreement and the visa liberalization, as I said, but that was attached to the readmission agreement kind of negotiations. The financial support mechanisms, and in this case it was FRIT, and with a more updated function in that regard. What was maybe novel or unique in these instruments was the one-to-one resettlement of refugees. That was kind of unique for the Turkey-EU statement. But the other ones were not necessarily specific to the Turkey-EU statement, but already existing in different kind of programs or policy areas with the EU. So keeping this general framework, when we look at the achievements of the EU-Turkey deal, we can see that it tried to trigger the relations with the EU institutions and the member states, and the interaction increased. It also achieved one of the most important goals from the perspective of the EU, which was reducing the irregular crossings dramatically. In 2015, it was about 1 million refugees or irregular migrants were crossing the Aegean. It's about 900,000. And we see that in 2016, it dropped to 180,000, and in 2017, even further to 42,000, and in 2019, 56,000. But we have to look at these numbers with a pinch of salt in this regard, because these are not merely numbers that are dropping. Some scholars argue that these numbers were dropping anyways. It has nothing to do with the Turkey statement. So whoever was going to cross the Aegean has already crossed in 2015. So even if there was no EU-Turkey statement, probably there's not going to be another 1 million crossing in 2016. But no matter what, I mean, it's very difficult now, and I think it's very speculative to look back and see if there is going to be a drop or not. But what we can see right now, when taking a picture, that the numbers dropped. When the numbers drop, obviously, the smuggling activities have reduced as well. So in that regard, it was successful. From a security point of view, from a humanitarian point of view, from the EU, that was positive. Because around 2015, crossing the Aegean was about, it's been estimated that about 3,000 euros. And by 2019, it dropped up to 1,000 euros. It's like a basic economics of supply and demand. Also from the point of view of the getting back to control its borders and security, and moral and ethical considerations were also met with positive repercussions on the global image of the EU. There are no longer, Aylan Kurdi, a little baby dying on the Aegean. So in that regard, it was positive. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind these numbers dropping may also suggest that people were going through different routes as well. So the route of Italy or the route from North Africa, not necessarily meaning that the number of people who were crossing reduced, is just they might be taking more dangerous routes to cross. But from the EU point of view, it was positive because the Schengen system was no longer under threat. The threat of crossing borders, which could have serious, the threat of closing borders, which could have a serious repercussion to the European integration project and EU's global aspirations, were also deterred. So it was also a positive kind of conclusion. But not all this presented itself in a pink and rosy image, as the statement's compatibility of the legal framework through the EU acquis was also scrutinized. I mean, there were discussions on the legality of the statement. Not necessarily this statement was legally binding. So it is basically, as the name suggests, it was a statement. It was not a treaty. It was not an agreement. It was barely a statement. That didn't necessarily come with legally binding obligations. At least this is what has been argued by the European Union side. The Turkish diplomacy was arguing the opposite at this moment. And also it was not necessarily accountable because it didn't really go through the European Parliament. So in that regard, there was this gray zone of the legality or the legal standing of the statement. So one of the ambassadors of Turkey that was at the time of negotiations that were in Brussels argued that Turkey was able to intervene the content of the progress reports during the negotiations of the deal, which has weakened the objective nature of these reports and their impact of or influence for the future. So as we can see that through this, Turkey was also able to instrumentalize this process to be able to get what it wanted from the accession negotiations with a more kind of positive, less kind of critical progress report. From Turkey's perspective, Turkey was not able to achieve the strengthened accession negotiations it was hoped for, or intensified high-level dialogue after the summer 2016. The summer attempt created a major blow to the visa liberalization process, and I'm going to leave it up to Kemal to discuss even further. And the modernization of the custom union was not achieved. The only major positive outcome for Turkey was securing 6 billion euros, which it received 4.2 billion in the last 5 years. There are also strong criticisms on the scope and the usage of these funds as well. There are certain conditions and conditionality and limiting the usage of these funds on certain functionalities. And Turkey criticized that the EU was very late to send these funds, and they were going through certain civil society organizations and through different projects, which kind of limited the impact of these funding options. So with these aspects, we can see the transactional nature of the deal, instrumentalizing the irregular migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers as negotiation tokens. And that's one of the major criticisms in terms of questioning the legality and morality of the deal. And also reducing the accession process, as has been discussed by Othon and Mehmet, a mere transactional relationship. It also opened, in a way, the possibility that the EU can use these kind of functional relationships specific to certain policy areas. And this kind of created a model for the EU to be later developed to other countries or regions, like in the case of the European neighborhood policy in North Africa, and with different aspects in the Middle East. So from the refugee integration point of view, the Turkey-EU statement has also triggered the development of changes in the legal framework of international protection and migration policy in Turkey. The statement paved way the preparation of regulations on work permits for persons under temporary and international protection. It also made sure that the regulations are in place for persons to be able to have legal work. But the legal developments targeted to accelerate the economic integration of refugees in Turkish labor market through formal employment only had limited results. It was very difficult to get formal work permits, and only 132,000 work permits has been issued until 2019. That's the latest numbers that has been officially declared. When you consider that there's about 3.6 million Syrians, this indicates that approximately 4% of the Syrians under temporary protection, a working population, has formal employment. This percentage is very minor, which means that the majority of the refugee population is working informally, underpaid, without formal social and health security mechanisms, in unskilled jobs that are not wanted by Turkish citizens. So the last 10 years means that informal integration of the Syrians into Turkish society happened, and formally about 130,000 Syrians are now Turkish citizens, and most of them are highly skilled. So looking at the general outlook, what are the challenges that we can see for furthering or the renewal of the Turkey statement? We can see that the challenges have been that the funding has been distributed through project-based integration models, which only has limited kind of impact. The continuity of the push and pull factors exist, as we will see. Franck will be talking about the Afghan crisis, that this is not the end of it. This continues. There are crises, different crises happening. And funding through international organizations or civil society can also be limited. The most consistent approach that the EU has provided to Turkey is through the financial assistance mechanism of the emergency safety, social safety net, the ESSN, which is developed by the statement. It's direct cash transfers to the refugees who are in most need of financial support. But other kind of projects for like skills or language acquisition or training or network building can only access to a very small number of refugees, so very limited kind of impact. Through these mechanisms, we can see that there's a need for the continuity of the direct cash transfers, because especially Turkey is no longer the Turkey with the economy that was presented in 2011-2015. Turkish economy is really on strains, and especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic conditions worsened. It has been indicated by the recent research that has been done by Othon, an NGO. During the pandemic, about 70% of Syrians who were working informally has lost their jobs. It just shows that how much it is necessary to continue to have a support mechanism to make sure that the livelihoods of the refugees continue to exist. Also, there are very limited number of resettlements, which was also part of the Turkey-EU deal, hoping that there is going to be a fair kind of distribution mechanism within the EU itself, going back to the in-house kind of dealing with issues within the EU. I mean, this EU Turkey statement also presents what are the challenges that the EU is facing within itself as well. And this is kind of a reflection of the limitations that the EU is facing within itself, like in the case of the resettlement distribution within the EU member states, which didn't necessarily bear a very fruitful result by the end of the Turkey-EU statement. We also have to keep in mind that there is rising xenophobia in Turkey over time, and more.
I'm sorry for interrupting. In terms of the challenges, I've got timing challenges as well.
Okay.
We're already into 18 minutes. If
Okay.
you could wrap up in just
I will wrap up in a minute.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry. As you're not next to me, I can't, just communicate with you. It's one of those challenges. And sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm wrapping up. So as I can say, so it is important that for the future, the limitations or the challenges of the deal has to be kept in mind, which I already mentioned. It is important with respect to strengthening the EU values and EU's credibility, and it also makes sure that the Turkey, in terms of the deal, how this is going to be expanded has to keep in mind these limitations, not to repeat those limitations again. And I see that there is a willingness from some of the EU members specifically to continue with the Turkey-EU deal. And from a Turkish perspective as well, the continuation of the financial support mechanisms is necessary, if not absolutely needed. And I think I'm going to leave it here. I think there will be other issues that we could discuss, and we'll leave them up to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Başak. I mean, thank you very much. As you said, I mean, you set up the ground for all, just other, just panelists as well, just by telling us, just by providing us with an analysis of the deal so far. Now we will continue with Franck. Franck is, again, certainly one of us, our own Franck. Franck is currently a senior researcher at the Center for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies at Osnabrück University in Germany. Before that, between 2006 and 2018, for a good 13 years, he was here at the University of Oxford. He was an associate professor and senior researcher at Compass. Between 2018 and 2020, he was the head of the migration department at the German Institute for Integration and Migration Research, the so-called DESIM. I mean, for those of you who are working on the field of migration, I'm quite sure you know Franck's publications. He has been working on that field for 25 years, for more than 25 years. And he's a worldwide known expert on irregular transit and forced migration with specific focus on Turkey and Ukraine. And Franck will focus in his speech on the most recent Afghan crisis, how it affected the climate between Turkey and the EU, and how it has also affected the talks with respect to the continuation of the so-called deal. Franck, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Mehmet, and thanks also to Othon, the whole team, and Başak for her presentation. As it's been explained, I will address or I will contribute the Afghan angle to the debate. I'm certainly no expert on Afghanistan. I came across Afghan refugees, asylum seekers in the course of the last 15 years of my research. I still rather have questions than answers. I hope I will not offend the Afghan audience by my ignorance. But a couple of remarks I'm going to make, but then I also comment on Turkey and EU matters. So when we discuss and talk about Afghanistan, specifically migration, we talk about an extremely complex case, and that means that we need to consider a whole range of issues and how these interact with one another. And I say this because in the discourse we come across too many simplifications. So even the very notion of Afghanistan is problematic. It's based on this very Western idea of a nation state, but it brushes over the ethnic diversity of the country. So we should rather talk about the different groups within Afghanistan, the Pashtuns in the south, the Tajiks, which are the second largest group. There is rather in Iranian people, the Hazara, which is the third largest group settling in central Afghanistan. But we also have the Uzbeks and the Turkmens in the north. They are rather Turkic people. The Hazara, I should have mentioned, are a Shia minority in a predominantly Sunni country. They have historically suffered from a genocide. They've been persecuted by the Taliban. So lots of issues we need to take into account, adding to this complexity of persecution and violence and forced displacement within Afghanistan and internationally. Also, the drivers of migration are rather complex. It's not simply and all about violence and war. I quote a British Parliament report, but it's a combination of poverty, the coronavirus pandemic recently, underdevelopment of social services, droughts, the ongoing conflict, shortfalls in funding for agencies and NGOs. So it's a whole range of drivers. There have been several major droughts from 1995 to 1999, 2018 again, and again now in 2021, contributing to internal displacement, conflict, and migration. I quote a report by the Organization of Islamic Countries: Afghanistan remains highly vulnerable to natural disaster. It tops the list of most at-risk countries. Currently, just under half of the population, 70 million people, face food insecurity. So again, it's not only violence and war, it's also other issues that drive migration, forced migration. Large-scale forced migration, of course, we all know this, dates back to the times of the Soviet invasion in 1979. 1.9 million people fled the country immediately. By the end of the 1990s, there were 6.2 million Afghans. That was the largest group of refugees then worldwide. When in 1992, the Soviet regime fell, 2.6 million people immediately returned. It was partly a major repatriation operation by the United Nations, UNHCR. So that was sort of global governance with all the diplomacy behind that. But when the Afghans came to power a couple of years later in 1997, there were again up to 1 million new IDPs. Afghans were again fleeing the country, up to 300,000-400,000. After the toppling of the Taliban, refugees began returning again, 1.8 million by that time. So it was a very dynamic, very volatile situation over a very long period of time. Currently, there are about 2.5 to 2.8 million registered Afghan refugees, mostly in Iran and Pakistan, plus many 100,000, if not millions of irregular immigrants, mostly in Iran, but also in Turkey, of course. So altogether, the Afghan refugees are again and still probably the largest group of refugees worldwide. I've mentioned Iran and Afghanistan, but there are also around 300,000 Afghans in Turkey, 250,000 in Germany, 100,000 in the US, 35,000 in the UK, Greece 22,000, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and even Ukraine. There are about 10,000 dating back to the post-Soviet era. In other words, so Afghan forced migration is in numerical terms the largest challenge for forced migration governments, and thus a major concern for refugee diplomacy in the region, but probably also worldwide. Iran, and that's another issue which I know even less about. But Iran, because it is situated between Afghanistan, Turkey, and the EU, and because two main migration routes or corridors run through the country, is in terms of migration governance, the geopolitically most relevant case. And it's definitely understudied, under-researched, and we know far too little about Iran and the situation of migration in Afghans. The former head of the Turkish Migration Service, Attila Torres, claimed in a recent workshop that I had organized that Iran is key for understanding migration from Afghanistan, in particular for understanding westbound migration. This is because Iran is a major host country of Afghans. There are about 3 million Afghans, the majority irregular, and some research suggests that 25% of the Afghans in Iran, of these 3 million, aspire to stay in Iran, whilst 30% wish to move on to the EU, and 50% aspire to move on to Turkey, whilst only 30 or so percent rather want to return. But that was before the current escalation, so matters have changed. Many of these 3 million Afghans are in Iran for 20, even 40 years. It's partly the second and even third generation. Many Afghans engage in transnational activities, for example, by sending back to Afghanistan remittances, or by temporary migration for purposes of seasonal work in Iran, for instance. However, the economic crisis of Iran, notably because of the economic crisis caused by the sanctions, devaluated the Iranian currency. And that means that Afghans in Iran send less money back home to Afghanistan, and they also have a lot less to survive on in Afghanistan. And we know from several studies that a significant proportion of the Afghans arriving in Turkey, but also in the EU, are not coming from Iran, but they rather had previously settled, they are not coming from Afghanistan directly, but they had rather previously been settled in Iran. So the situation in Iran, the drivers of migration in Iran are very important to understand Afghan migration west towards Turkey, towards the EU. Another point I want to make is that the Afghanistan crisis of 2021 triggered quite some moral panic with regards to migration and refugees. For example, in Turkey, we saw headlines such as the Afghan exodus reaches Turkey, with references to 500 or even 2,000 daily arrivals. The Iranian government estimated it could face an influx of 500,000 Afghans over the next couple of months. Also, the UNHCR contributed to this panic discourse by saying that it would expect 500,000 Afghans to leave the country within this year, 2021. And the German Minister for the Interior topped all of this by saying he expects up to 5 million refugees to leave Afghanistan. And this was sort of informed, inspired, spurred, I would say, by the events of 2015, 2016, when over 1 million refugees arrived in the EU. And whilst the majority were, of course, Syrians, 650,000, there were also 250,000 Afghans a month then. So about a fifth. However, these were rather threat perceptions. And so far, forced migration from Afghanistan is surprisingly low. These sort of threats have not materialized. By the end of September 2021, so this year, UNHCR only registered 35,000, so very far from the 500,000 they've projected. There are no more reports, I believe, of an Afghan invasion in Turkey. In Greece and in the EU, only around 2,200 Afghans have arrived this year so far. This is 30% of the total. The other of these 6,000 arrivals are Syrians, Iraqis, Iranians, and many others. Of course, so far also 125,000 people have been evacuated from Afghanistan, but these were mostly non-Afghans. And Afghans have been airlifted to many countries. Reuters reported that, and I quote, President Joe Biden's administration has been holding secret talks with many more countries than previously known in a desperate attempt to secure deals to temporarily house at-risk Afghans. But this diplomacy behind the evacuation, the shipping of Afghans to countries as diverse as Albania, Kosovo, Qatar, and Uzbekistan, and their further resettlement, and these secret talks behind this are, I think, an interesting case in its own right. And as I've said, in Turkey, there are probably around 180,000 registered Afghan refugees and another 120,000 irregular Afghan migrants. These are the numbers you find in the Turkish media. So it's a total of 300,000. But in the meantime, Turkey has been constructing yet another wall, a concrete wall, 3 meters high, razor wire, CCTV and all the rest of it, along the Turkish-Iranian border. 20 kilometers are completed, I believe, 240 kilometers are under construction. The border guard brigade has been deployed, 750 police special forces, drones, unmanned vehicles, you name it. And I quote, according to Turkish authorities, security forces have prevented the passage of over 69,000 irregular migrants and arrested a few hundred human traffickers. And this, the construction of the other infamous wall on the border with Syria in 2016 was supported by the EU in that several projects for vehicles, security and surveillance technology was funded with 80 million euro. And there are claims, but I have no evidence yet, that the wall on the Iranian border is also again subsidized by the EU. It is remarkable that in the respective journal article in the Turkish media, that this is placed in the diplomacy column. It's also written in English, so it's rather targeting a European audience. And whilst President Erdogan warns again that the country won't become Europe's refugee warehouse, there are no signs or threats this time to let down controls in the Aegean Sea or on the land borders. Instead, Turkey seems to engage diplomatically with the Taliban as well as Pakistan, and I quote, to try and bring stability to the war-ravaged country. And some of the rhetoric we now hear from Turkey resembles the language we used to hear from the EU. For instance, the Turkish Minister for the Interior, Soylu, recently stated, quote, there was a high level of illegal refugee pressure from these countries, and we have been in close communication with these two countries, referring to Afghanistan and Iran, to bring numbers down. So this reference to illegal refugees, to pressure, or the indirect reference to the root causes of migration are all well known and tested discursive frames used in the EU. And coming back to my previous point, the EU statement of 2016 still holds. Yes, numbers of arrivals in the EU are extremely low, lower than in pre-Syrian crisis period, around only 6,000 people so far this year. However, different research projects have meanwhile confirmed, so I agree with Başak, that Syrians hold rather low migration aspirations, and very, very few, less than 1%, can actually afford to migrate, whilst the majority prefers to stay in Turkey, around 50%. This is rather different for Afghans, who are more likely to hold migration aspirations. I've quoted the numbers. So de facto, the statement between the EU and Turkey to install Turkey as a border guard of the EU rather largely applies to Afghans, maybe some other nationalities, but less so to Syrians. And I'm kind of coming to the end now. It seems to me that there are two interdependent circles of diplomacy. So notably on the one hand between Turkey and the EU, and on the other hand between Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others. On the one hand, President Erdogan talks to Merkel over the phone and reiterates that Turkey will not accept any more refugees. But this time, Erdogan did not support his argument by the threat to letting down Afghan refugees, to let them through to the EU, but rather signals that in Turkey's view, Germany and Turkey are in the same boat, that neither country can or wants to accept more refugees, that the countries therefore have joint interest to prevent Afghans from migrating west, notably with their regards to their position in Iran. But on the other hand, with regards to Afghanistan, I also see maybe a new alliance of Turkey, Pakistan, Qatar, and even the Taliban. And I thought these are two really interesting new turns in diplomacy. However, I doubt that this is understood and appreciated in Germany, because over here, public and policy is rather anti-Turkish for reasons of Erdogan's authoritarian leadership, polarization, and human rights violations, which overshadows other sort of issues. It also seems that Turkey is not only accepting, but even adopting the EU concept of externalization of controls, and thus begins to exert pressure on other countries of origin and transit, notably Afghanistan, but also, of course, Iran, by building this wall. For instance, the Turkish media outlet Daily Sabah, which is close to the government, justifies the construction of the Iranian wall by pointing out, and I quote, that its neighbor Greece has just completed a 40-kilometer fence and surveillance system to keep out migrants. So saying, we only do what the Greeks have already done. And with respect to Iran, Turkey claims the border also improves Iran's security in that it prevents the mobility of smugglers and Kurdish terrorists. Finally, a few words on the facility for refugees in Turkey.
Frank, those will be brief words, right?
Very brief indeed.
Thank you.
The latest evaluation of Fritz is rather mixed. It is suggesting that the money spent on benefits is rather insufficient, that it doesn't offer a sustainable perspective, in particular because the program failed to invest or address the economic integration of Syrians, whilst Syrians are rather stuck in benefits dependency. So one of the key EU instruments, I would say, is rather toothless. In diplomatic terms, it's a very sensitive issue because the EU can't really tell Turkey to integrate Syrians into the labor market. Finally, Germany has decided to prolong and double its investments in refugee integration projects in Turkey. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much, because the Afghani angle is very frequently the forgotten angle, frankly, in these conversations, because Turkey-EU conversation on migration diplomacy is very much centered around the Syrian question, but you highlighted how important it is to recenter the focus on the Afghan issue as well. Yes, now we're just just last but not least, I mean, as it is conventional to say, we've got the doyen of Turkish migration studies, just Professor Kemal Kirişci. Hocam, it's very nice to use the word doyen after Abadan Hoca. Now we are referring to you as the doyen of the field, but of course you are coming with two hats. Not only in this, you've been working on the migration, not only Professor Kirişci has been working on migration studies, he's also, of course, a professor of international relations, and he's an expert on Turkish foreign policy. He was the director of the Turkey program at the Brookings institution. He is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings institution. And before moving to the Brookings, he was for years professor of international relations at the Bosphorus University. Today, Professor Kirişci's talk, his intervention, will focus on the mobility-related issues, freedom of movement-related issues, especially the so-called visa-free travel that Başak has mentioned, which was a part of the deal. Why it has not materialized? Will it be just one of the topics to be negotiated between Turkey and the EU going forward? And if it is going to be one of those issues, what are the prospects for that human mobility between Turkey and the EU? Kemal Hocam, you've got the floor for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introductions. I'm going to address two questions. How come visa-free travel made it into the March 2016 deal, or whatever you want to call it, and what's the likelihood of it entering into an updated, retouched deal? The issue of visa-free travel has been on the agenda of EU-Turkey relations, I would say, since the 90s. Since the customs union agreement was signed, very quickly, business people began to argue that their goods were traveling freely, but they could not follow or accompany their goods, and that this was leading to a welfare loss in terms of additional commerce and business there. Subsequently, when we come to the 2000s, and as Turkey's democratic and economic performance improved, and the EU citizens, tourists, professionals, students began to pour into Turkey, more and more a double standard became evident, that EU citizens, and some of them could travel to Turkey without even passports, let alone visas, while Turkish academics, professionals, students, artists, business people were still stuck having to apply for these visas. Thirdly, the number of asylum seekers and irregular migrants from Turkey dropped significantly by the late 2000s. So much so that the number of Turkish nationals seeking asylum and finding themselves in an irregular situation in the Schengen area was less than the number of nationals from Western Balkan countries who had been granted visa-free travel. This pressure was somewhat, the pressure to have a visa liberalization regime for Turkish nationals was counterbalanced by the reluctance of the Turkish government to sign a readmission agreement and replace its liberal visa regime vis-a-vis third country nationals. That occurred in 2013, 2014. Once the Turkish government fell in line with this requirement coming from the European Union, it became terribly difficult to resist, not to address this visa-free travel issue in the migration deal of 2016. Plus, we must not forget that at the time, the hand of the European Union was very weak, given what was unfolding and was referred to by Başak earlier on. And Davutoğlu was skillful in negotiating this deal. I doubt with the factors that I made references to in mind, but for his own internal political agenda that backfired on him. What was the outcome? The outcome is, if you go to the statement from March 2016, there's a paragraph that calls on the European Commission to go and assess Turkey's performance as far as the benchmarks listed in the roadmap towards the liberalization of visas for Turkish nationals. And there was a promise that once this assessment was completed and shared with the Council and the European Parliament, the Council would decide on a qualified majority and the Parliament on simple majority by the end of June 2016. What happened instead? What happened instead is that there was a coup attempt. In a way, the coup attempt came to save the European Union commitment to have to extend visa liberalization for Turkish nationals. I won't go into the details of what happened in July 2016, but from then on, I would argue that the rest is history. And whether visa liberalization will come from Turkish nationals, frankly, is very well captured by a Turkish saying from the 1970s that says, "Kırmızı kar yağınca." Pretty much impossible for the coming at least 5 to 10 years.
Hocam, translation would be nice, when it snows red.
I don't know, Mehmet, if you would be familiar with that saying, but it was a very common saying in the 1970s to underline how impossible something is. Now, why is that the case? Why is it that I think this visa free travel for Turkish nationals will not prevail or will not happen, even if it was to enter a new deal, updating the one from March 2016. First of all, foremost, the EU enjoys much greater bargaining power over Turkey and over the president of Turkey compared to what the case was back in 2015 and 16. The Turkish president scored an own goal. For the English audience, you could call it a nutmeg, by threatening to set off Syrian refugees, 3.6 million of them, towards Europe, opening the borders in February, March 2020, and then the whole thing backfired. And in many ways, the bargaining power of his position were lost there. Secondly, Turkish democracy and economy is not where it was in 2013 and 14. I need not go into the details of it. Thirdly, visa-free travel is not as a hot issue as it used to be back in 2012, 13, 14. Turkish GDP per capita at the time was around almost $13,000. Together, today, it's down to about $8,500, and I need not to reflect on how €1 was 2 Turkish liras then. Today, it's 11 Turkish liras. There are very few Turkish nationals who would wish to travel and be able to do that towards the European Union or to the European Union. Instead of visa-free travel, there are other burning issues, and again, I need not go into the details of it. Asylum and irregular migration from Turkey is in an uptick. The figures are reported by Frontex as well as Eurostat. And I'm sure many of you followed earlier in the year how great passports were abused by municipalities, a number of municipalities, I won't say run by which political party, to get people through to the European Union, as great passports, together with the so-called green passports, are exempted from visas. Mentioning another factor that is going to complicate the introduction of a visa-free travel commitment coming from the European Union in a New Deal is that Turkey has expanded the access to green passports beyond state employees, which had been the case for a long time. I can go on with the list. I don't want to bore you, but Frontex, one of Frontex's most recent reports on fraudulent documentation, unfortunately lists Turkish and Senegalese international airports as those from where many people are turning up at European EU airports with forged or fraudulent documentation. And lastly, something that hasn't come up so far, if you go to the new pact on asylum and migration that the European Commission proposed way back last year in September or October, please go to page 21. And in page 21, you're going to see that the Commission turned upside down the idea that visa-free travel could be offered as an incentive to cooperate for migration management with the European Union, and instead is weaponizing it by saying that if a third country fails to cooperate with the European Union may introduce restrictive measures to the travel of its third nationals. So in conclusion, if you go back to what was being written and published in 2012, 13, 14, just as finally the Turkish government accepted to sign and ratify the readmission agreement and began to change its liberal or align its liberal visa policies with the European Union, you will see publications that underline how this arrangement, visa-free travel for Turkish nationals, would be a win-win for both sides. Time is limited. I don't want to go into the details, as I am determined to conclude this presentation with within the 15 minutes that Mehmet had called us to abide with. Instead, I think what we're going to see a further isolation of Turkey, and I want to flag out that the world has moved on and into confronting a new agenda resulting from the COVID-19 related restrictions and how to manage those restrictions. And I'm not very sure, let alone visa-free travel, whether Turkey is going to be able to join, participate in a diplomatic manner in this dialogue that is going to address how to manage these restrictions and then make sure that that mobility returns back to its buoyant state prior to COVID-19. There is a very serious consequence that can come out with a Turkey that is more and more isolated, and that is that the European Union and that literature focused around a win-win outcome will find a Turkey that has increasingly turned inwards, increasingly nationalistic, and increasingly unable to relate to the values and norms of the European Union. And with those remarks, I conclude my short presentation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kemal Hocam. It was an amazing, just presentation, and it brings to the fore an issue, just that we have not been discussing much, frankly, lately. Yes, now we're going to turn back to our audience for their questions. We've had 3 wonderful presentations. I will start with the in-person participants. They have taken the health risks, COVID risks. They've come here, shown courage. That's why we're going to start with the in-person participants. But I'll try to get questions from